Hello and welcome back, everybody. It's our second episode of Transforming Relationships, a podcast we hope you fall in love with as much as Eric and I already are. So I'm here again with my co-host and friend, Dr. Eric Spiegel. I'm Dr. David Alter. And to give us a little bit of background on why today we're going to take a deeper dive into the nature of hypnosis, trance, the process of change, and how that relates to the many topics we're going to be talking about over the course of our episodes. So, Eric, talk to us a little bit about why this.
Well, David, it's so good to be with you again. And what an important question for us to honor and an important topic for us to be talking about today. The reason that we felt like it would be a good idea to come to this topic for all of you today is because hypnosis, and even more specifically, states of trance, exist in a naturalistic way in everyone's lives, whether they recognize it as such or whether you don't, but it's there. And so we thought that by defining more precisely what exactly that is, giving you some rich examples of how that happens, it will really set us up for future episodes for this show. Because ultimately, this is really not a show about hypnosis, but it is a show about how hypnosis impacts people's lives, and particularly how the naturalistic state of trance unfolds in relationships, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by design or by accident, with a specific aim or with a degree of randomness. And so, in a moment, David, I'm going to kick it back to you with a few follow-up questions. But one thing I just wanted to begin to just really elucidate for our listeners is that hypnosis is a state. And that state is what is often referred to as a trance state. And trance states occur naturally, but they can also occur as part of a process. And that process is what is often referred to as hypnosis. So hypnosis is a state, but it's also a process. And that process, could be happening in a therapeutic or health kind of context. That's why it's often referred to as hypnotherapy. It could be happening in a more entertainment kind of venue, which is, what people often associate with stage hypnotists. So it's really important to begin by differentiating between the naturalistic state and the process that can be utilized to evoke that state. And in keeping with the focus of our show, that process is very much a relational process, one that's unfolded by relationship. This is the last thing I'm going to say before I kick it back to you, David, but I think people often underestimate that relationship process because, no two hypnotic suggestions are the same. It's all about the context with which those suggestions unfold and the relationship that contains them. So, David, you might want to respond to some things I've said in response to your question, but I also really specifically wanted to ask you, as a way of introducing to our listeners, how you feel that trance states reflect the innate capacities of the brain, and how are trance states evoked in response to the many contexts that we live in? What are your
Okay.
thoughts?
Okay. Thank you for pitching me such a nice big softball. Not really. It's an enormously complex, multi layered question. Let me start here. Uh, In the first episode, we talked about how most living creatures have two sides of the brain, each of which is designed to focus and process different kinds of information. Building on that, and this will be clear in a few moments, building on that, much of the brain and much of life is devoted to conserving energy. Now, that sounds good, right? Who wants to waste energy? But in terms of the work that Eric and I do with our clients, when we are too attached to conserving energy, it means we are setting up roadblocks to change. It creates pressure to keep doing the same thing over and over and over because it's easier. The pathway to do the old habit has already been laid down. So life, including human beings' lives, need a process to disconnect, to disorient from that nicely greased path to be able to move into something new and different. And the essence of that key to unlocking us from what was into what can be, to opening up the possibility to do something differently, to feel something differently, to see and imagine and anticipate something differently, rests on this need to be disoriented and then reoriented, to unlearn what we already know so we can begin to learn and do something new. Now, the name for that neuropsychological or neuroscientific process, in a sense, is trance. And it's not owned by hypnosis. You can do that in a great hard beat thumping nightclub with a great band, and it takes you to a different place. It can happen in the reverence of a church or synagogue or mosque. It can be on a wild retreat with drumming sessions. It could be under the influence of psychedelics. It could be evoked in the context of listening to a charismatic speaker that we will say leaves you feeling entranced by his or her words. So there are different common everyday examples that touch on our underlying biology and neurobiology that speaks to how we unlock from what has been and open the door to some new possibilities that can be, that are, in a sense, what Eric and I work with every single day with the people that we help to open those doors. So with that, how does that dovetail with what you alluded to, Eric, when you said this is not really a show about hypnosis? Hypnosis is something we want you to understand better, but it really rests on this idea of trance. So how does it fit into this podcast called Transforming Relationships? What's that about for you?
Well, David, I feel like we must just be playing combined slow pitch softball here because it feels like you just served me up the best softball I could take a swing at. I mean, I don't know if I'm alone here. I am sure many of our viewers on YouTube and our listeners across podcast platforms were having a similar experience of just feeling like those examples you gave were coming to life. They were so evocative. When you were talking about the pulsing bass of the nightclub, naturally, my own personal association was to my hobby love of DJing. And I'll throw a metaphoric anecdote right back at you. Um, one of the things about DJing is that it's really dependent on there being as little friction as possible, right? Which is what trance states create, is they create
Oh,
frictionless
nice. Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And what makes that process work is if you have a nice slip mat between the record and the turntable. And my slip mats are actually called butter slip mats because it feels like butter. And when do you know that you need to change something up? It's when the needle gets worn and the record gets worn and it's digging into the groove. And so that's what I took from your examples, that what hypnosis does is it gets us out of our well-worn grooves and it helps us to create new music, new grooves so that we can get lost in the groove.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's somebody beating a drum or at a nightclub, or as you mentioned it, on a meditation retreat. And I think the last example was the most evocative to me because it speaks in a way to our show, right? Which is the power of listening to a really influential speaker, right? You have this sense of connection, like I am just lost in this rapturous way in the way that that person is speaking. And I'm going to use an example that is quite notorious, but speaks to this, is the power that people used to say that Adolf Hitler's voice had on those who listened to him. He came to power at a time when radio was a new medium and people had this new capacity to hear people's voice, and he had this way of just really manipulating his voice to evoke emotions in his followers. And so, I don't mean to kind of get with something that's obviously, quite notorious in history, but it just really goes back to this idea that power of trance state, and whatever the form is of connection is, and with whom the form of connection is, really has the capacity to leave us wanting to come back for more of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's a good place to transition to a question for you, which are, what are the brain states that are
Mm-hmm.
associated with a trance state like this? What makes this happen?
The question of what is happening in the brain that is trance is a question that has intrigued modern researchers for decades, especially as we've become more and more able to use sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated tools to, in a sense, look under the hood, right? So, beginning with EEG, electroencephalograms, these sensors that are put around the scalp that pick up the energy of electrical activity underneath the scalp. And we have taken a look at what are the patterns that
Hmm.
indicate, oh, that person has fallen asleep. Oh, that person is dreaming. Oh, that person, unfortunately, has slipped into coma. Ooh, that person is really processing a lot of information. We can see that in the brain waves. But
It's like a
then
guide.
it's sort of a guide. But then when the question is, so what is the electrical pattern for trance? There isn't one. There are many, right? There are some general findings when people have experiences that are in trance. There's more activity in the right side of the brain than in the left. That's interesting because the right side of the brain is more associated with what's new and different and uncertain. There seem to be areas of the brain that become more active relative to other areas of the brain. Oh, so is that what's happening with trance? Not really. It depends on which area of the brain the person speaking is being spoken to. So if I'm talking to you with a lot of visual imagery, you'll see more activity in visual networks. If I talk to you with sound, if I'm having you listen to music, temporal lobe regions where we process sound vibrations may be more active. So, no, we don't see it there. What we do see is that areas of the brain are each doing their own thing at different
Mhm.
levels of activity, the right generally more than the left. But what's fascinating is that those different areas seem to be doing their own thing together. There's much more interconnection and integration. And what really blew me away is when I learned that when we are listening to metaphorically rich stories, when we're absorbed in a tale, or as you said a few moments ago, really entranced with the speaker, if in that moment we looked under the hood, we'd see that that person has more connections going on, more active connections going on across the brain, as though, and this is a major point in this Transforming Relationships podcast, in a sense, we're at the precipice of change, at the threshold of change. When everybody gets on board, everyone gets activated to one extent or another, everyone is oriented to, whoa, this is different. This is a new and exciting experience. And when that happens, whether it's in a music concert, a meditation retreat, a fantastic retreat that you go to for work where you talk about the future of your company and everyone walks off floating 3 feet in the air, or you go to your therapist who's trained in clinical hypnosis to help you move past the pain of trauma. Those are the elements that seem to be the brain state elements that seem to be present. Right hemisphere activation, multiple areas of what we call neural networks that are active, and those networks are talking to each other in an inwardly focused way. We're internally directing our attention. And I know, Eric, for you, the whole issue of attention, hypnosis, and trance is an important one. Could you talk to our listeners a little bit about the nature of attention or how you use attention when you're doing hypnotic work? It might be really interesting for people to hear. What does that actually look like when a skilled clinician is using that?
And David, I think it's safe to say that if anyone is taking the at-home exam on this episode, that the answer to that last question was all of the above.
Yes, 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 exactly. Yeah.
And and I think that's a great place to pick up with what you're asking, because as I talk more about how attention plays out in hypnosis, one of the things that I'm going to really emphasize is linkages, the power of linkages. And specifically in hypnosis parlance, we call those contingent suggestions, where we link two things together. So, in your example, you were talking about evoking multiple senses together. You don't just have someone see themselves on the beach. You have them seeing, the water kind of coming back and forth as they feel the transition of warm, dry, flaky sand to wet, hard, packed sand beneath their feet, as they smell the salt water in the air, as they hear the seagulls. It's about evoking multiple senses, because that's really what creates that immersive experience. And it's also what really drives home a point. If you're trying to help someone to get to a certain place in a therapeutic process, it's really important to make that connection. So, an example of a contingent suggestion might be, you know, just as you can enjoy the experience of the transition of the sand from hot and dry to cool and wet, from soft to hard, as you can feel that shift from one experience of being on top of sand to another, you can also become aware of the power of making positive transitions in your life. And this is where I start to kind of freestyle a bit, going with the DJ piece. So I might say something like, as you go from feeling like you're spilling all over the place, which is, of course, what people feel when they're walking on the hot, dry sand, to feeling like you're more organized and cohesive and put together, right? Which is what people might feel when they're walking on more densely held together sand. So that's an example of a contingent suggestion. And, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what does this have to do with attention? Well, a hypnotic process is only as good as what attention we bring to bear. And so that's the second point that I want to make, right? Which is hypnosis is really about shifts, going with this idea of transitions. You know, when we focus in on something more closely and we have absorption, we're invariably focusing out of something and we're having dissociation. And so, you know, whether people are just kind of almost on their own accidentally going into trance states or it's part of a more intentional process in therapy, the idea is to use these shifts in attention to elicit a particular kind of attention, to pay attention to something in a certain kind of way that's going to lead to subsequent changes. And that's actually, I think, a great place for you to speak a little bit about how the brain is perpetually active. Because I think that people, they imagine that, oh, well, all hypnosis is just sitting on a couch with my eyes closed, becoming relaxed. But going with the all of the above, there are actually multiple different types of trance, and they speak to the ways that the brain is active perpetually and in different ways. And I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
What what comes to my mind is to first of all reinforce something that you said that I think is a really important point. Trance and hypnosis is not when a person's brain is inactive, vulnerable, ready to be manipulated by somebody else or something else. Okay? The brain is always active. It's just active doing many, many different things. And it's which of the things that the brain does that reinforce old patterns, and which of the things that the brain does that enable new patterns, and how do we get from the one to the other. That's really, in a sense, the field of hypnosis. How do we take what is already there? In the clinical field, we call it utilization. How do we take what's already there and influence it so that it can transform, it can
Right.
modify, it can shift into something else that's also already there, but was being underutilized? So, an image that I have used with clients is this. I might ask, have you ever been to a museum where your head feels like it's on a swivel? You're just noticing so many things and which exhibit you want to look at first and what you want to pay attention to first and what you want to go check out first. Now imagine going into that museum when it's pitch black. Every exhibit in that museum is still there. Every pathway, every doorway is still there. How do you navigate? Well, what if you're given a flashlight with a powerful beam? You're able to aim that light at something, and what you're aiming at becomes visible. It's what you see, it's what exists. But if you turn, you will see something else that was already there. It's just a question of what you're aiming at. As a clinician, as a therapist, I find that people come to see me with the habit of training their light in one area of that life museum where they keep seeing the same thing over and over again. So in a sense, what I'm doing is helping them turn a little to the right, drop your right shoulder, lift your left,
Hmm.
turn your foot a little bit this way, and begin to notice what comes into view. And of course, you can choose to move toward it or away from it, or you can just stand still and notice how a sense of interest and curiosity and wonder begins to develop and spread, etc., etc. So that's part of Eric and I are modeling the language we use, going back to what Eric has talked about with his fascination of the power of the spoken word. You're hearing us use what the brain already does in having narrow and focused attention or fairly broad and diffuse attention, but we learn how to influence it so that new experiences, new perceptions, new ideas, and new possibilities come into view. I'll give the listeners a quick, I don't think it's an acronym. I guess it is. It's the four the four S's of attention. So I want you all to think about how you do this in the course of your day. The first S of attention is the S of selection. You have to pick something to pay attention to because you can't pay attention to everything. And when you have something in mind or something in focus, you go to the second S, the S of sustaining. You maintain your focus. People with ADD, for example, are finding that there's always something new and shiny intruding into their focus. They can't concentrate, right? So we have to have the ability to sustain what we have selected. And as we're sustaining what we have selected, we have to be actively doing the third S, which is the S of suppression. While I'm paying attention to Eric, sustaining my focus on Eric, his words, his voice, his ideas, I have to suppress any other thoughts about what else I need to do today or whatever else might be outside my window so that I can stay focused and absorbed in my connection to Eric. And then the fourth S is at some point we shift. At some point we learn to shift away from what we've been focused on and toward something new and in that moment more relevant and meaningful for what it is that we're trying to achieve. So whether we're taking a walk through the in the dark museum with a powerful lantern or practicing the four S's, they're just different aspects of what the brain does and how that shows up in our day-to-day lives. And we're going to be talking in future episodes about what shows up in our lives, what we're paying attention to, what we're not noticing that's there that could be relevant and important to live a more joyful, healthy, wellness-oriented life, deeper connections to our partners or friends or spouses or children. So in a sense, it builds off of attention. Any thoughts about this, Eric?
Well, my brain is exploding, David. Boom. So first thing, I had never even heard of those four S's before. And so just hearing about that for the first time brought up so much. You know, the immediate thought that came to my mind was that I think in society, we make so much of the sustaining of attention and of the suppressing, I guess, of the forces that might get in the way of that attention. And I don't think we pay enough attention to the power of selection and shift. And in your beautiful description of utilization, I think you really brought those two S's to bear. And my 2 cents would be that I think that that's the skill, right? If people could, you know, didn't have to worry about the selection and the shift, I think it would be much easier to sustain your attention and to suppress things that might get in the way of that. And actually, coming back to your example of people with ADHD, you know, the misnomer is often that they can't pay attention. They can pay attention just fine. Sometimes they're hyper focused. I think the issue is with that selection of what to attend to and the ability to kind of get caught up in distractions of different things, which coming back to I think the relationship component, it's like if you have somebody who's a real master in helping draw attention to something, and oftentimes it's something it's not necessarily something external. It might be something internal. And I think that's actually something you referenced but didn't say directly, which is hypnotherapists often refer to something called internal resources. That hypnosis, it's not just that you're utilizing whatever external thing is happening. It's that you're helping people find the resources or strengths that they didn't even know that they had. And I think a really good example of that, and maybe in a way kind of brings to life the shining of the flashlight, is I'm a big basketball fan. And it's amazing to me you had, and I might be getting my year off by a year or two here, but you had the maybe 2013, 2014 iteration of the Golden State Warriors, the team that had Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, right? Well, Mark Jackson was their coach, and no knock on Mark Jackson, really great point guard for the Knicks back in the day, and he did a fine job coaching them. But they made a switch in the offseason, and in comes Steve Kerr for I think it was 2014, 2015, but I might be off there. And amazingly, right, in 1 year, he completely turns the team around. And the same thing, by the way, was true of the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan when they went from Doug Collins to Phil Jackson, right? So, how is it that you have a team, right, that is essentially the same team, but they get a new coach and all of a sudden they are just accessing capacities that the players didn't even know that they had. And I think that that's what, you know, you're really speaking to in utilization of internal resources, that the right coach, the right motivator, the right therapist, the right guide knows how to shine that flashlight in just such a way that whether it's narrowly focused or more kind of panoramic, that it helps people recognize something inside of themselves that they didn't know was there. And that's what leads to change.
What comes up for me, is it okay if I jump in here? I'm
Yeah, please do.
not
No.
interrupting you. What comes up for me around the idea of the coach, with my background, I think that we have an internal coach, and
Tell us about that.
that is called the prefrontal cortex. Okay, people think, oh, that's the area that makes the decisions. That's the rational, logical brain. That's where we exercise judgment, and that's what makes planning possible. All true, all true. But in my studies, the most important role of the prefrontal cortex is inhibition, is selectively putting the brake on different impulses that are always active under the surface, deeper in the brain, so that what gets experienced in our minds, what gets felt with our feelings, what gets sensed with our perceptual systems, and what gets acted on behaviorally is well regulated. It's regulated for what is most suited for the person and their state of health balance, and what is best suited, best regulated for their social context, right?
Hmm.
So if you're in a meeting with coworkers and someone says something, the boss, the team leader says something that you really vehemently disagree with, you may feel the desire to stand up and say, "You idiot! What are you thinking?" But if you are in an internally regulated state, what emerges is an inner dialogue, maybe a request to speak with your team lead after the meeting, maybe even your ability to offer a comment that says, there's some things that I really like about what you're saying and some things I see differently. I'd love to talk to you about them another time. So there are different ways of acting under the influence of the internal coach so that you bring forward different things that are already there, but in a different pattern, or to use your
Right.
metaphor, to run a different play. So
Right.
it's this is part of what you're hearing from us is that Eric and I really look at this multi-layered nature of attention, trance, change, potential, inner resources that happens within the individual biologically, what happens between the individual and someone in their life, what happens with a new group of individuals in their community, and on until we see national or international movements. Folks, we're all in the game together. And if we look around the world these days, we see that we're not playing so well together.
Right.
As the governor of Utah, following the Charlie Kirk assassination, said, we have to disagree better. And I thought that's a beautiful two-word statement, disagree better, that is in a sense at the core of what Eric and I will be talking about. How do we disagree better internally, in ourselves, and with others? So, Eric, any final thoughts about that in terms of kind of wrapping up today as we get ready for our next episode with all of you listeners? Can't wait.
Well, I was curious about something technical in what you were
Okay.
saying before we wrap. So you were talking about the role that the prefrontal cortex plays as a dampener.
Hmm.
And I think you were giving a really good example of why we need more dampening. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit
Okay.
to how that dampening may change in hypnosis. So what happens to the prefrontal cortex? And I know you said earlier there's all kinds of changes depending on what kind of hypnotic work is being done. But I was wondering if you could speak to that. And relatedly, one of the sort of knowledge tidbits that's always stuck with me when I learned trance is that hypnosis dampens the emotionally overactive centers of our brains. So, somebody comes in, they have, flooding anxiety, and hypnosis can kind of bypass those emotional centers. So I was wondering if you could just say a little
Sure.
bit more about that process in trance.
What you're touching on is, at least for me, a very important goal of what we help people to understand and learn about and put into practice in their lives over the course of these podcast episodes. What my research, my study suggests is that yes, there's a dampening of the deeper structures and centers in the brain, so we're not acting impulsively, we're not hyper reactive, we're not locked into hypervigilance. The prefrontal regions, especially areas called the cingulate gyrus and another area called the insular region, are more active, as though the the cingulate areas, which are more oriented to integrating what's out there into what's in here, inside the self, and the insula much more oriented to integrating what's in here with what I need given the context that I'm in. And those areas seem to be more active when a person is in a hypnotic state, in a trance state, absorbed in it either through a session of hypnosis or some other setting, like a meditation retreat or something like that, where in that more active state, it's not out of control, it's bringing forward those levels of activity that are basically saying, here I am. Where do you want me to go? How should we work together differently? They have to show up in order for them to be incorporated into a change process. And I think the research suggests that trance is doing that. It's bringing certain hyperreactive, intense, reflexive
Right.
reactions, and it dampens them. But other areas that are active doesn't mean they're dominating. They're coming
Right.
forward with an open heart and an open mind, if we can use that image, and saying, look, I'm here. This is important. What can and should we do next that would be better for me and for you and for us?
That was so nicely said. It really speaks to how hypnosis targets that part of our brain that is so receptive, right?
Mhm.
It's engaging that receptivity in a back and forth interplay with another person, with another human being, and that's a really great place, I think, for us to pause as
Mm.
we get ready for our next episode. And in future episodes, we'll be talking more about that back and forth in relationship.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, how does time fly? By the way, folks, one of the features of hypnosis is time distortion. I could swear that Eric and I have just been talking for 10 minutes, but an hour has come and gone. So I guess I've been in trance the whole time I'm talking with you. So
And it may feel a bit like time is stretching until our next episode. We hope that you'll be waiting on bated breath. But one thing we know is that when we get together again, it will just feel like no time has gone by at all. And it will be so much fun to just enjoy the process together of just letting time fly by when you're having fun.
okay. So until next time, Dr. David Alter signing off. Can't wait to see you again soon.
And this is Eric Spiegel saying goodbye until next time.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to catching up with you again in our next episode. A quick reminder, while we are both doctors of psychology, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, does not offer diagnoses, or engage you in actual treatment. The conversations, the opinions of our guests, and any information that we share here are meant for your general knowledge, your learning, your inspiration, and your motivation to put some of our ideas into practice in your day-to-day life. Remember that everybody's body and everybody's personal health journey is different, so what works for one person may not be right for the next or for you. If you have questions about your health, any psychological or medical condition, or any changes that you're thinking about making to your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise routine, your medications, or some other aspect of your life, it's always best to talk with a qualified healthcare professional who knows your personal history. Never ignore or delay professional advice because of something you heard here with us. We want you to enjoy the show and to walk away with useful insights, but ultimately, you are responsible for your own health decisions. Please use your best judgment, stay curious, and always listen to your body. Take care, be well,